Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jasmine. I'm from Carcanet Press. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight as we launch Paul Stephenson's debut collection, Hard Drive. Thank you for being here. I can see loads of people are still more joining us now. It's really exciting. There's so many of you here. I'm just going to quickly run over what's happening and then I'm going to hand over. So I can see some of you have found the chat box. Please do say hi to us. Let us know where you're watching from. Let us know what you think of the reading as we go through it. Paul is here and he's going to read for us. And as usual, I'm going to have the text up on screen for you as a visual guide. Do remember, as ever, that you're in control of your screen. You can have a play around with it and you should be able to reconfigure it if you need to. And if you have any technical problems, just pop those in the chat as well, and I'll do my best to help you as we go through the event. We are also joined by Susanna Hart, who I will introduce in a moment. She's going to be in conversation with Paul later on in the event. So as well as finding the chat, please do also find a separate button which says Q&A on it. And if you've got any questions for Paul, then later on in the event, she'll be able to put those to him. While you're using the chat, please can you make sure that you do select the option everyone from the drop-down menu instead of hosts and panelists, otherwise we won't all be able to see each other's messages. But I mean, I think that's all the basic stuff out of the way. So I am very pleased to introduce Susanna Hart, who is on the board of Magma Poetry. Her debut collection, Out of True, won the Live Canon First Collection Prize in 2018, and she also won first prize in the 2019 National Poetry Competition and was commended in both the 2020 and 2022 competition. So go and find her work if you don't know it. But for now, I will ask her to join me on screen so we can get going with the reading.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jasmine, for that introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be introducing Paul Stephenson and his brilliant first collection, Hard Drive, tonight. Many of us have been looking forward keenly to it, I know, and I don't think I've ever heard or seen the words long awaited said or written so often about a collection. I don't need to tell any of the audience tonight that Paul is a really gifted poet, but he's also extremely hardworking and dedicated to his craft. More than that, he's a very insightful and thoughtful teacher. He's very generous with his time, and I think lots of us here will have been the grateful recipients of that generosity over the years. And he's a wonderful friend. So I've been lucky enough to share Paul's work and his friendship over several years. It's been a wonderful privilege and pleasure to see his poems and his craft as he's been working on them, to see this collection take shape. So I'm personally really delighted that I've got this chance to celebrate with you and with him tonight. I'm sure you'll all know Paul's poems from his work in magazines. He's very widely published. He's been placed and won numerous competitions, and he's also got 3 existing pamphlets. Those People, which won the poetry business competition with Smith's Doorstop. With Happenstance, he's got The Days That Followed Paris, and with Paper Swans, Selfie with Water Lilies. After Paul's reading, as Jasmine said, I'm going to be chatting to him a little bit, asking him a bit about the collection and about his practice. And we're going to be inviting questions from you as well. But before Paul reads, which is obviously the main event and what you're all here for, I'm just going to whet your appetite with a few words that other people have said about this collection. Sean Hewitt says, "This is a heart-stopping debut of real emotional force and poetic intelligence. Paul approaches the elegy through a kaleidoscopic, inventive, and genuinely moving use of form." Jonathan Edwards talks about how Paul applies his great gifts with heartbreaking clarity and bravery to the most unfaceable of subjects. Penelope Shuttle says, "These meticulous and attuned poems spare neither reader nor the poet, nor should they. This collection is a stoic and grounded narrative telling of deep-rooted love and loss, of witness and grief." Matt Howard said, "I think it heartbreaking, beautiful, playful, inventive, pure, and above all, simply astonishing and thoroughly Paul's own poetry." And before I hand over to Paul, I'll give the last word to Zoe Walkington. It's bloody brilliant. Paul.
Thank you so much, Susanna, for such a generous introduction. And thank you to Jazz and Lucy for setting up this launch event, and to all at Carcanet for the work on this book. especially John McAuliffe for working with me to edit the manuscript, and to Andrew Latimer for the close attention to the design of the book, which I think looks absolutely fantastic. And a huge thanks to all of the poets and friends watching this evening. I'm going to read an extended set of poems working through the book, fairly short poems, really, just one longer one, and I won't do too much talking around the poems. Now, the book, as you may know, is in 6 parts. The first 3 parts deal in very practical terms with the aftermath of the death of a long-term partner. The latter 3 parts go back in time to explore the relationship and explore the act of writing around death and loss. And I think Jasmine is going to bring the poems up onto the screen for you. So you can choose to see me or see the poems on the screen. A first poem that's the preface poem for the collection, Anglepoise, and you'll see an Anglepoise lamp here behind me. Anglepoise. You'll be in the front room at your computer, surrounded by your family of Anglepoise lamps. The novel will be making steady progress. I'll be in the kitchen with my laptop and radio editing some poem or other, devoting an hour to the question of a comma, semicolon, full stop. Voices will drift up to me from where you are. My drama will drift down the hallway to you. There'll be hot radiators and rugs, curtains drawn. We'll both be home, absorbed in our projects, each working our way through the bottle of red. I'll be alive. You'll be alive. It'll be like old times. So the first section of the book deals with the immediate aftermath of a death. The next poem is called The Thesis. It was June and I had to see a student. A Tuesday morning and I had to see several students. I knew something was wrong. I called and asked a friend for help. I was far away and I had to see a student. She said she'd go round and ring the bell. I tried to listen to the mouth of the student. He or she was seeking my approval. I knew something was wrong. It was June and I was seeing a student. I gave some useful advice. I gave a smile. I knew something was wrong. I wished them well, saw off the student. The deadline was approaching for submitting the thesis. It was late morning and I had to see a student. I sat across from a student, faced the thesis, and then across from another student. I waited for my friend's call. My friend was in London. I knew something wasn't right. I worked my way through the students. Signature. In his sleep, except he isn't really sleeping, that's just what we like to tell ourselves. He looks as if he's grinning, as if he knows something new, has seen a sight to comfort him and offer reassurance, so he can close his eyes for good. Or else he's understood once and for all what us lot don't, that this here is one massive joke, some lame farce from the beginning. I wouldn't be surprised, because he had his own sense of humour. Black, in the mishaps and embarrassment, saw the human comedy, relishing the doddering and stumbling of others, their sticky situations. How they keep on talking, words making it worse, digging a hole for themselves. I look at his mouth and he's not saying much, but keeping stumm, lips sealed, mum's the word. And I'm positive, 100%, that he won't tell me what is tickling him. Not this time. I edge up, lean in and steep over, allow myself to touch his forehead, lay my palm flat on the long fringe, and with my thumb caress each fine brow, stroke them in the right direction. Feel the love, cold and wet from refrigeration. Masterpiece theatre. Standing there, I peer up into corners of the ceiling, check for CCTV, a pinhole camera or discreet lens, some hidden device in place to catch my gullibility. This has to be a stunt. An overgrown student prank, each whisper, each tear for public entertainment. With that tight grin, I wouldn't put it past you. What is this? A black comedy laid on just for me? So you're playing your part. Am I saying my piece? On cue with my improvised script of not much? I say goodbye in one last touch, my legs moving towards the door. In the instant I turn, see your head tilt towards me, your eyes blinking open, staring back. And you can read the continuation of that poem on the following pages. It's called Not Dead. Grief. It's not what it used to be. Because it used to be gravel flicked up by a spinning car tire that punctured your heart. It used to be a hungry gruffalo that flattened you when you went for a walk. We're talking weeks deep in a grotto with underground lakes, nothing but the drumming of stalactite drips drilling into your head. Back then, it was the garbo of all garbos. I want to be alone forever. A grueling Greek tragedy in 3,000 acts. It used to be day 4, and gripped by sorrow, the desire to drown yourself ungraciously at Hampton Court Lock. The second section of the book deals with some of the bureaucracy and administration, as well as the rituals around death. Voicemail. Sarah is away next week, so would like to speak to me today if it's convenient and not too much trouble. She wants to go over some of the finer details and explain how things will generally go from here. Sarah needs to check she's understood correctly and revisit a few points so we can move the process on. She'd like us to consider the options together and ensure I'm fully informed re decisions to be made. Sarah says a number of procedures must be got underway, that she should be in touch ASAP with the necessary parties. Sarah tells me 1 or 2 loose ends need tying up before she leaves the office for a fortnight's holiday. Sarah has written me an email to this effect on Monday. She's thankful and looks forward to talking with me. Sarah hopes to hear from me this afternoon, preferably, and would be very grateful if I'd return her call. The button. Michael appeared, just as he said he would. He issued hushed words with a soft Irish accent, his demeanour tidy, calm, professional, familiar. We had to get going. Someone was after us, so it couldn't run over. Michael just wanted to talk through a few last details, including the button. The button, there, next to the wooden lectern. He guided me over. Would you like me to take care of it? Or when we got to the final song, would I be up to it? Could I bring myself to take care of the button? He'd be on hand, standing at the rear of the chapel. Looking back, I don't know how I pushed it. Or if he said to push or press or what verb, if the button was green like green for go, green as the pool table lawn, or red, red as the brick arches and spent roses. Or was it black? Why did I push it? Push because I was a crazed control freak that July Tuesday, me playing at Master of Ceremonies? Or was it out of duty? The button, I mean. For it was silly, like an Amdram prop. Though the button was small, it was also violent, and oh, I shouldn't have been allowed to make a person disappear with such a tiny weapon. Oh, it was horrid in its automation, melodramatic and almost camp. Yes, that's it, it was camp. Vulgar and hammed up, a tasteless step, banal, extravagant, which was act in an affected sort of way, because T would likely have pressed it himself, acting out a theatrical ruse. It's just if nobody had pushed the button, the huge curtain wouldn't have wrapped round, and I'd never have caught a corner glance of the doors parting, letting in a sharp slit of white light as he was taken. He'd have lain there, in situ, our modest gathering, filing out into the midday sunshine, and I'd be even more a mess, knowing I'd not sent him off completely. Beneath that bed of summer flowers I flung on as they carried him in, a meadow all orange, purple, all yellow. The hymn of him, the ap of him, the bop of him, the cap, the cop of him, the cup of him, the dip, the fop of him, the gap of him, the hip, the hop of him, the jip of him, the lap, the lip of him, the map of him, the mop, the nap of him, the nip of him, the pep, the pip of him, the pop of him, the quip, the rap of him, the rep of him, the rip, the sap of him, the sip of him, the sup, the tap of him, the tip of him, the top, the VIP of him, the whip of him, the yep of him, the zap of him, the zip, the ship of him, the shop of him, the sharp, the chap of him, the chip of him, the chop. Collecting you from Golders Green. The young woman, lady, female, behind the desk, counter, reception, spoke gently, softly, calmly, seemed genuinely moved, emotional, upset. And I thought, how generous, kind, ridiculous. For she never knew Met was acquainted with you. She checked her screen, monitor, computer, and vanished, took her leave, was gone. I sat on the sofa, couch, settee, looking, staring, glancing around the office at the pot plant, cheese plant, cactus, until she came back, returned, reappeared. She was holding, carrying, balancing a large, sizable, ample brown container, receptacle, cardboard box, neatly, immaculately, pristinely sealed with your name, surname, identifier on a white label, sticker, square in jet black. I got in the car, vehicle, motor, and sat, positioned, placed you safely on my knees, legs, lap. I felt the weight, pounds, load of you, as Jean drove, escorted, chauffeured me, away, to Highgate, to hers, home. The third part of the book explores possessions and stuff, emptying an apartment, and storage units. And I think the book itself is a sort of storage unit of grief and loss, really. So there's lots of clearing of books and objects and furniture. Clinically proven. I take your face creams. They're in the bathroom drawer, some empty, some on the go. Your Regenerist serum for neck and jawline from Olay. Your Regenerist 3-point super firming serum from Olay. Your Regenerist micro sculpting cream from Olay. Your Revitalift concentrated serum from L'Oréal Paris. Your Revitalift Miracle Blur oil-free instant skin smoother from L'Oréal Paris. Your Revitalift double lifting day jour moisturizer from L'Oréal Paris. Your Revitalift triple power day and night cream from L'Oréal Paris. Your Revitalift broad spectrum SFP20 sunscreen from L'Oréal Paris. Your Men Expert Vitalift lifting moisturizer with intense double action pro-tensium and pro-retinol 2-in-1 firming gel plus anti-wrinkle cream from L'Oréal Paris. You should see my face. It's so smooth. The éclat, the glow. And I think we'll go down to hard drive, Jazz, I think, given the time. Thank you. I talk on the Carcanet blog about what hard drive means, and there are many interpretations. Could be the difficult journeys, it could be determination, it could be lust, it could be all sorts of things, but the most obvious meaning when it comes to the book is obviously the hardware that we store our life on. And this is a poem that can be read either across or down. Hard drive. Our life is out there somewhere. On a hard drive someplace, dark and silent, deep inside, we are saved. We are stored, all we were, us recorded, for the time being ignored. Our love is out here somewhere, love that drove us someplace we didn't know we hadn't been, safe and secure behind closed doors. All the files, in all the folders, switched off, put away. I'll get a man to locate our life, to retrieve our life, our love, and transfer it so I can relive it someday, our life of years, all the days, sitting there, unlooked at, us, collected. Some people wait for years to dispose of ashes, and this is, I think, why this poem comes a little bit later in the book. Better verbs for scattering. To dizzy wind the ashes, to kind release the ashes, to rock set the ashes. To light allow the ashes, to day away the ashes, to zizek the ashes. To arose is arose the ashes, to deruck the ashes, to Nabokov the ashes. To let blend blow the ashes, to let current carry the ashes, to Stephen Stevens the ashes. To let air dance the ashes, to breeze give the ashes, to Fabrizio De Andre the ashes. To unworry the ashes, to sun sow the ashes, to Susan Sontag the ashes. To undespair the ashes, to debonair the ashes, to Flaubert the ashes. To desparple the ashes, to usher off the ashes, to Torriemos the ashes. And the second part of the book, sections 4 and 5, go back in time to explore a relationship, travel, a shared life, but also the sort of relationships that remain. Caldo verde, soup with collard greens. Remember stepping off that bus in São Martinho do Porto? The old lady at the stop, how she led us up the hill to her house, then took our passports and euros and moved in with her mother. Eating dinner on the roof beneath the stars, the silence of the sea. Remember always starting with your caldo verde, dark green like seaweed. How on that last evening we poured the rest away and watched it block the sink. No plunger to hand, how we bought a product to shift it, emptied the bottle and headed out for a drink. Remember getting back, going to the kitchen to check on progress, finding the pumice eaten away, the metal drain and pipe exposed, how we covered it with a plastic basin, the old lady next morning ringing her own bell and how we pocketed our passports and fled. Remember running for that train, as it moved through the town, how we slid down in our seat, how we felt guilty for the old lady, lived in fear of the old lady, and at dinner parties told the story of Portugal and of our old lady, you serving up your caldo verde. And I think I'll scroll down now to I Can Be Happily. Thank you. I can be happily engrossed in some, have my head stuck in, looking out at noticing the new, admiring the curve fixed on the weigher, lost in the recent and oblivious to. I can be enjoying the quiet, browsing the latest, choosing between or flicking through, taking in all the catching up on my, touching base with, planning and overdue. I can be peering over it, preparing a small, getting ready for in the queue, looking forward to when suddenly I, out of nowhere, picture you. And could we go down to intentions? Intentions. Autumn again. And I've been thinking about Pennsylvania. the trees, the leaves, and your parents on the porch overlooking the yard. Like this time last year when autumn came and I got to thinking about Pennsylvania, its trees, their leaves, the technicolor, and your mother and father together on a warm September morning on the porch overlooking the yard. When I say autumn, I mean fall. The sight of fall and the thought of it all those reds, oranges, yellows, and pinks. How many falls since my first thoughts of going, since those first ought-to-goes came into my head? Each year my thinking brightens, until the thoughts begin to dry out and brown and, one by one, start falling. You drove me, in their old Volvo, through the Appalachians, and in the Foster Joseph Sayers Reservoir we swam. We left the car, and in the darkening depths of Bald Eagle Forest got caught out. The two of us soaked against a trunk. Talking of reds. Nurture. I was raised as a tomato. In a tomato-shaped house, my bedroom walls were tomato red, the carpet too. I was shy, didn't play much with the other tomatoes, and locked myself away, cataloguing my tomatoes. I spent what little pocket money I had on tomatoes. Most evenings watched tomatoes for hours on end. Mum was half tomato. Sundays she'd iron my tomato. My packed lunch was tomato ketchup sandwiches. Weekdays I'd run and catch an early tomato. My favourite subject was tomato. I was good at it. A small-sized tomato, other tomatoes bruised me for being a bright tomato. Sad, unhappy tomato. The careers officer planted a seed inside my head to work hard and become a professional tomato. So I went to Tomato University, took a joint degree majoring in tomato, but with a minor in tomatoes. There were so many tomatoes, some sour and green, but one ripe and blush tomato, I wanted to eat it. A well-rounded tomato, sweet sense of humor, origin, the United States of tomato, beefsteak. We rented a tomato and filled it with tomatoes, collected rare tomatoes and placed them on a shelf. Weekends when we weren't training our tomatoes, we'd go on excursions, walk around old tomatoes. If our tomatoes were flat, we'd pump them up. Tomatoes flew. We deepened in colour, made soup. And obviously that soup was caldo verde with a few tomatoes thrown in. The last section of the book explores the act of writing around such difficult subject matter, the consciousness of the author engaged in what they're doing, questions of ethics, legitimacy. And it's a section that I sort of added in when we edited the manuscript. I regrouped some of the poems. So I'm going to read 3 more poems. Putting it out there. See, here I am worrying myself to death about commodifying your death, arranging and sequencing your death, curating the left and right pages of your death, deciding which parts of your death to leave out. Here I am again, giving a title to your death, choosing an attractive cover for your death. Will your death have French flaps? Writing intelligent sounding blurb for your death, thinking how we might best promote your death. Who might best be willing to endorse it? Still me, waiting to be sent a proof of your death. I'll need an eye for detail to check your death for typos. I've got to get it right, the finger feel, the texture of the paper, of the pages of your death. Ensure a sharp jet black for your death's ink. I'm wondering about the numbers in your death's ISBN. Before I sign off on your death done, and wait for a box with hard copies of your death and organise things to launch your death finally, then wait. For reviews of your death, hopefully considered, to be told how well your death has sold. Now, if, of course, we were on a normal Zoom and we had the gallery view, we could see like many, many heads all tilted like that. But we're on a webinar. So this poem, Starchitect, 2016, contains all the words that were added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2016. Starchitect. He was my air-punching Alpha Centaurian, my bammer and shaker, my basic wage answer book, my bish, bash, bosh, my Bodhi tree, my bother, my bro hug. He was my centeredness, my char grill, my defo flouter, my glamping jackalope, my go bar, my hackable sensi, my human being, my crump lamellophone, my left justification, my right justification. He was my Lakembe, my likeliest palm, my listicle, my long-running, my take, my play-to-play mofongo, my refleet, my Scooby snack, my self-selected right-footer, my sleep suit, my snuzz. He was my softscape, my splendiferous sense, my starter marriage, my startful mood tink, my stratum corneum, my test drive, my Top Gun, my vlog, my yogurt. And my last poem, I knew it was going to be the last poem when I wrote it. And I like the kind of immediacy and physicality of this poem. Wedding in Limousin. I'm writing this in the swimming pool. In a swimming pool in which I am the only swimmer. I've stopped swimming to write this poem. Here alone, just arrived, my first swim. 3 trains and a taxi, 38 degrees, a June heat wave. Standing here cooling off, the robot cleaning underwater, almost company. A pen is letting out its ink. A notebook covered in wet patches from my wet arm, right hand. Blotched words. Sun. Sun hot on my back, the blanks of paper wrinkling into waves. France. Sound of a tractor and a moment ago, church bells. A breeze, honeysuckle. All this way. I have come to represent you, but I'm also here for me. Hey, a swallow just skimmed the pool, was off again, 6th in a row. A swallow for each year you've been gone. It's time to swim. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul, for that wonderfully textured and very moving reading, also very funny at times. You know, I've been very struck reading your collection by your very creative and inventive use of language. I know you come from a languages and linguistic background, and you play with language in such a lot of different ways in your poem. I mean, I'm thinking sometimes you're even inventing language, like in better verbs for scattering or condolences, where you add those double Ds in. Can you just talk a little bit about, you know, why and how you do that?
Thanks for the question, Susanna. Yeah, I mean, I come from a languages rather than a literature background. And yeah, I suppose you are thus interested in rules and in word order, in sound and finding equivalences and learning new vocabulary the whole time, of course. And I think with better verbs for scattering, I was just struck by how inadequate and even misleading the verb scatter is. I mean, it's kind of haphazard, but also a little dainty. So I was looking for other words that would better express the experience. And I came up with a lot of compound verbs, but also tried to, you know, use names and nouns as verbs. And it was also a chance to sneak in a little bit of the person and their favorite authors and musicians. So it's kind of a way of cataloging somebody for posterity, really. I particularly like, you know, To Rock Set the Ashes. I think, you know, bringing in a Swedish pop band into the proceedings works rather well. Condolences, yeah, is a poem that jumps on the frustration and exasperation of what was a very innocent misspelling. And I guess he had his whole life experiencing that. And then it uses that double consonant, the DD of Todd, to create a word hoard, I suppose. And then I select those words, use them as a constraint to create this kind of crazed, angry, short narrative. And I think the poem, placed where it was in that first section, it sort of throws an emotional spanner in the works, after a series of very serious poems. And I mean, for that reason, I really like Starchitect, that celebration of new language. We don't know what the words mean. We don't care what they mean. We will make our own meaning from sound, and it comes back to that question, doesn't it, of sound versus sense. And I'll always choose sound and music and let people find their own meaning. And I think that poem is very emotive through the accumulation of nonsense, really, an attempt to exhaust the dictionary and offer up everything you can to express love and grief. And you realize, that language is not enough. It's never enough.
That's really, really interesting. And it touches on what I was going to ask you next, which is, with that verbal dexterity, you really make fantastic use of lists and inventories. I mean, Starchitect's an example of that, how you've taken these words that we don't know the meaning of and made them so meaningful. So I think the varying types of repetition you employ is a really striking feature of your work, and you do it so well. I mean, poems, and this will encourage everyone who hasn't got the book to read it, poems like Your Name, which uses that Todd again to, talking about the name there, Nurture, Clinically Proven, you read, Grief as a Covered Reservoir. Can you tell us a bit about, your writing process and how you come to those lists, those inventories, or does it just happen? What does it do in your work?
Good question. I mean, who doesn't love a good list poem? It's a way of gathering and collecting, sorting, ordering. And I think in that process, rearranging so you can, find interesting juxtapositions, arranging word lists to create music. And, repetition is a powerful tool, isn't it? A very powerful rhetorical device. And it helps convey insistence, relentlessness. It can even create a kind of incantation and take you to unexpected places, as I've done in the past with Oulipo and N+7 games. And if the poems you mention, Your Name starts off simply by exploring the etymology of a name, but it's when it goes beyond English and you start exploring Dutch and Turkish, and then you end up with the Spanish, the todo, the todas, and all of that, and then you have repetition, and was the kind of surprise emotional ending there, again through repetition. And Clinically Proven, that was a lot of fun to write, using this ridiculous language of cosmetics and that repetition of Olay and L'Oréal Paris, which makes me smile. But it's also a very sad poem, about our futility to stay young and gorgeous and stay alive. And Nurture, I just replace every noun with the word tomato to eject a little bit of surreal into the proceedings and create new visual meanings and ideas. And like Covered Reservoir also uses water and anaphora to create repetition, but achieve something that's quite suffocating and suggests the passing of time. And so I use humor a lot, but it's ultimately just a veneer really for other emotions under the surface. It's a coping mechanism. It seemed logical to joke about stuff because you can only wallow so much in grief. And I think you can genuinely be funny and still be deadly sincere.
Yeah, I think I think anyone who's listened to you read tonight can obviously see the truth of that in your reading. And actually that I mentioned of humor brings me on to my next question, which is about you're very aware of the absurdity of everyday life. I think Clinically Proven is a fantastic example of that. Those long names, the repetition there, but also the bureaucracy, you've used in the voicemail poem and some of your other poems about storage, dealing with admin, you're very aware of that minutiae and how it can create emotion in its absurdity. Can you talk a little bit more about how that inspires you and what you do with your observations? I'm thinking also of Grief as the Maastricht Treaty, which is another wonderful example where you take a bureaucratic document and yet manage to invest it with so much emotion.
Bureaucracy, thanks. That's a good question, because I do use a lot of found documents here in this book. I work at a university. I'm very, very aware of bureaucracy and administrative creep. it's hard enough to deal with life admin and get that done on a daily basis, but then you have this death admin thundering down on you like an avalanche. I think there's something kind of ugly beautiful in all of that kind of banal language, full of its own stock phrases and conventions, often very attenuated or politically correct language that seeks to sort of establish distance and be devoid of emotion. So it was perhaps, you know, a quest to find the poetic in what is at face value non-poetic. And yeah, again, I use the political language of an EU treaty. I use that treaty as a kind of palimpsest for my own poem. And that itself, of course, has its own very formal register, its word field, its phrasal structures. But when you then take that treaty and apply it to something very personal, that formal text kind of opens up and gives you an alternative way, an alternative structure to express grief. And I mean, in this case, a poem very much about self-indulgence and the self-indulgence of grief, because, you know, there I am in the poem being all these different ministers. So yeah, but again, that was fun.
Yeah, well, there are, as well as you being all the different ministers, there's lots of other people in your poems, and I noticed that most of them are named. There's also lots of places, there's lots of streets, and we've got Georgia and London and Paris. There's a lot of specificity, and I think that definitely, for me, adds to the richness of the poems. But can you talk a little bit about that and why you think it's important to be specific in your writing?
I think when we all do poetry workshops, you know, we're always encouraged to really zoom in on the detail. And capture, you know, our own unique experiences. And yeah, there are lots of people and places, administrators, medical workers, case officers, undertakers, librarians, people at the storage unit. And as I said in the Carcanet blog, you know, it's a bit like a soap opera of bereavement, really. I hadn't realized when I was writing that I'd accumulated this whole cast of characters, you know, incredible people with whom you have these very intimate but fleeting and finite relationships. And, you know, their composure, their restraint, their professionalism is just staggering. So it seemed sensible. I didn't really think about it, you know, to write about these people because they were integral to my experience. And my encounter with each of them represented a certain milestone on that road of bereavement in those first few weeks. And so names are really important. I only actually changed a couple of names because I found it very difficult to change the names. Those small details really matter, the specificity. I mean, it all adds to the authenticity of what I'm telling. It creates texture, you know, it adds to that sense of reportage, of preservation, and of giving people their dues, I think. I mean, it's a collective effort dealing with the death, I mean, like this book is. And yeah, places, yeah, I mean, there are day-to-day poems, the domesticity of home, as I started with Anglepoise and others in the kitchen. But there are also snapshots of travel, you know, the incidents and adventures that I think you look back on. I mean, I think often we talk about, you know, the anecdote in poetry, and that Caldo Verde poem is really just a bit of light relief. It's very anecdotal. But it's a poem that captures the essence of someone. Love of cooking. One of my poems where I'm having a conversation out loud with the deceased, as I do in, I think, quite a few of the poems in the book.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really, really interesting. I've got one more question before we throw it open to the audience. And that's, you mentioned the sixth section in your book, how you didn't originally plan it and it was in editing that came about. So could you just explain a bit about why you added that and how it did come about?
Yeah, there were 5 sections originally, and you know, we all like odd numbers and asymmetry, but it seemed a half dozen sections seemed right, because I felt that there were certain poems that needed grouping towards the end of the book that was sort of, yeah, it was zooming out a little bit maybe. I realized there were a number of poems that explored the act of writing on and around death, exploring myself, looking at myself from above as I write. Both worried about legitimacy and ethics of what I'm doing, but also thinking ahead of publication and readership. And you cannot divorce the two. You cannot separate the two. Very conscious in the act of writing, the knowledge that the writing will hopefully make its way into the world and be accepted or rejected, but ultimately will be consumed. And there were other poems like Birkenstocks earlier in the book, which I realize now could have moved to that section. And I think writing about writing, you know, it comes full circle really, because, you know, if we go back to the beginning of the book, Anglepoise, is about domesticity and companionship, but it's ultimately also about the act of writing.
Well, thank you very much for that full answer. And I think, yeah, when you read the poem, you know, the poem about commodifying your death, I think you've crystallized some of what you've said there in such a wonderful way there. Okay, I'm going to please do put your questions in the chat. I can see some questions are flooding in, so I shall start having a look and see what we've got there. Okay. Do you think of your poems, Gregory Woods asks, as belonging to a gay elegiac tradition?
Oh, that's a brilliant question, and one I will struggle to answer. Because even when I had the first discussion with Michael and John about the manuscript, I was saying, oh, I'm not sure that this is a gay or LGBT book. And of course, by 18 months passed by the time, you know, we got to the proof stage, and I'm thinking, of course it is, of course it is. A friend of mine, Ricardo, just read the book and said, but there's nothing gay in this book. It could be about a woman. Maybe there isn't, but I think it's perhaps the gay aesthetic, the gay humor, perhaps the gay way of looking at the world. But I don't know. I'd have to give that a little bit more serious thought. I wonder what Gregory thinks.
Okay, so that's an interesting question, because I realized we didn't talk at all about that aspect of the book, you know, and so it is very interesting to focus on that. Okay, Lisa Kelly asks that she's seen you cry with laughter at a Caroline Bird poem, and you've mentioned Luke Kennard as giving permission to write in a certain way. Who else do you think is approaching the surreal in an attempt to deal with difficult subjects, and do you think there are risks for the writer in that?
Gosh, yeah, Luke has been a brilliant, an incredible influence on me, giving me permission to write. Gosh, there are lots of poets who use the surreal, aren't there? I mean, Liz Berry, Pascal Petit, just to name a couple off the top of my head. Is there a danger in it? Was that the question?
Yeah, is there a risk to the poet, I suppose, in using the surreal to deal with difficult situations? I guess you can interpret that however you want, what that risk might be.
I think it's more of an opportunity than a risk. I think it's currency, isn't it? It's a way of trying out something. I mean, maybe the poem will fall flat, but it gives you a certain escapism, a certain distance from yourself, an opportunity to be absurd, to take ideas further than you might normally if you're writing the real rather than the surreal. But yeah, I've certainly been influenced by Luke, and I absolutely love Caroline's poems.
So do you think sometimes, coming back to that point, you know, when you say take things further, do you think with the surreal you kind of keep pushing the poem beyond the point that you originally thought you could, which is something I've heard Caroline Bird say about her process? About
building the road as you go along.
Building, yeah, just keep not thinking, you know, you could get that far, but.
Sure. I mean, the tomato poem, I didn't know where that was going, of course.
Yeah, great example.
And it just takes you somewhere that you just didn't expect by just messing about, really. And,
and it suddenly ends very poignantly, having sort of started off with such a little bit of kind of almost glib fun, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Ben Bransfield asks, this is interesting. As a poet and linguist, if the opportunity ever arose for you to write or collaborate on or approve a translation of Hard Drive into another language, in which language do you think Hard Drive might best work? Why? And do you think you'd find the process rewarding? So 3 parts: which language, why, and would you enjoy the process and find it rewarding?
Oh, I would love to. I mean, I did the translation, and I would love to work with the translator on the book. But I mean, I have thought that some of the poems are untranslatable. I mean, I don't know how you could translate humorous elbowings. That poem after Elizabeth Bishop seems untranslatable. But yeah, my goodness. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I studied French and Spanish, so those are my languages. Of course, I'd want to sort of work in. But I'd be welcome to anything, you know. Yeah. Russian, Swahili, Finnish.
So anyone out there who's thinking of translating, Paul's keen to collaborate. Okay, let me see. We've got a couple of other questions. Helena Nelson says, So you knew that the swimming pool poem was going to be the last poem, but do you really think that's it with the poems about losing Todd now? Is the catharsis complete? Has the poetic catharsis been achieved? Or is it just the last poem in this sequence?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, because, you know, as I may have said on the blog, I thought that the second half of the book would be a second book, and it's become this much bigger book than I intended. That poem in particular, I remember the poem happening. Just, you know, and for the poets watching, you know what an incredible feeling that is when a poem comes over you. It's the event, it's happening, because we never know where our next poem is coming from. So just the physicality of the poem, it was a very sensual, sensory experience writing that poem. But I just knew in the moment, that's it. This is the end poem. But I'm not sure if this is the end. I mean, I sit worrying about all the orphan poems. You know, there were a good 15, 20 poems that had to kick out of the manuscript, and I sit worrying about what will happen to them. Will they ever be collected? What will I do with them? And yeah, I didn't want to write anymore. But if one day I go into the storage unit and actually deal with all of this,
There's a whole collection in the storage
I'm
unit.
sure there'll be another collection called storage units.
Yeah.
But I don't think it probably is the end. I don't know. It's going to be a big question as to what to do next.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yes, because I know that you originally said that you didn't think this would be your first collection because you've been working as a poet for so long and have so many other different poems. So you've got that collection too, of course, all the other non-Todd poems. Another question, I don't know who posed this, but this came in direct to Carcanet before the webinar. Does grief feel different now? Has the book helped you move on with your life? Closing one chapter and opening another. It kind of builds on Helena's question, but it's, I guess, a bit more personal than about the writing. So feel.
I mean, yeah, I mean, coming back to the idea of catharsis, definitely, you know, I've spent 3 years during COVID on these, with my wonderful Saturday morning workshop group, you know, thinking, will I ever get published? Would these poems ever see the light of day? What if I get hit by a bus? You know, and just wanting these poems out in the world. So this it's just it's an incredible relief that these poems have seen the light of day, that they have a readership. That if I write nothing else, at least I've written this book. So in that sense, yeah, it's a catharsis. But there are other poems I certainly want to bring together. You know, there was another manuscript. So let's see. But I mean, I think, as John said, when we're editing, this book will determine very much what you do next. So let's let the dust settle and see what happens.
I think we've just got one more question, which, unless anybody else wants to pose one now, because we're coming to the end of our time. But Ben Ray has asked about your day-to-day reading of other poets and how that shapes your writing. You've mentioned Luke Kennard as an influence and Caroline Bird as someone that you really enjoy. Is there anyone else you'd like to mention, or?
Oh, there's lots and lots of poets I would love to mention. I subscribe to lots of journals. I do a terrible amount of skim reading. I'm a real magpie, and I'm guilty of not, you know, going in depth into people's work. There's loads of poets who I really admire.
It's okay, you don't need to name them if it's difficult.
From the early days of reading, of reading Paul Farley and Jacob Polly and poets like that, and Michael Lasky. To the American poets, you know, Tony Hoagland, that Peter Sansom introduced me to, and others. Yeah, many American poets I love as well. But off the top of my head, and of course I've been, you know, reading around Elaine Feinstein and Darren Rees-Jones and Mary Howe and all the, you know, all the kind of masterclass on grief that you have from these poets, which has very much informed my approach to writing around loss as well.
Well, thank you so much. Does anybody else have any final questions for Paul? We've got just a couple of minutes before the slot ends, but I'm sure, you know, everybody's really enjoyed both his wonderful moving reading and also listening to those really fascinating answers to the questions you've put. So if not, I guess I hand back over to Jasmine. Thank you very much, Paul, for that. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Susanna.
Yeah, thank you both. And huge congratulations, Paul. It was really moving hearing you read those poems. So yeah, thank you very, very much. And thank you guys for your amazing comments in the chat. Oh my gosh, it's been so lively. It's been really brilliant to see you getting involved this evening. And thanks for your great questions. I've put the link in the chat for you. We appreciate you paying your £2 to be here, of course. So the discount code is there for you. You can buy a copy. If you've missed that, it'll come as an email tomorrow. But as ever, just send me an email if you're having difficulty getting yourself a copy of the book, or all your friends and family who you should also buy it for. So I think that's everything really. Our next event, if you're in Scotland, you can see Leslie Harrison at the Scottish Poetry Library tomorrow. I'm putting a link in the chat there, and you can go to our events page on the website and sign up for the newsletter so you don't miss anything. But really, that's everything. So yeah, thank you guys very much.